As many of you know, Civic House's work expresses itself through the daily engagement of our students in service and advocacy work, the educational programming that consists of orientations, workshops, and panel discussions, among other forums. And implicitly, we engage in conversation about issues of importance to all of our constituencies, who include Penn faculty and staff, community partners, and the people with whom they work very closely, and others. And it's long been a dream of ours to have the opportunity through a public lecture that involves a broader audience to grab a moment in time to engage in conversation about those very same issues. And so we are very pleased to be at that point this evening. Some of the questions we'll consider tonight about justice, about action, and agency that are so important to our students and the rest of us help to drive our work at Civic House. Yet the opportunities to consider them publicly as community are fewer than we might imagine. Of course, they do happen in classrooms, on Locust Walk, and off Locust Walk, in group meetings and in public actions. But it seems to us that as long as equality, as long as justice remain elusive, we can't have enough of these discussions. Speaking for myself, I have students and colleagues at Civic House I see every day. And while I experience many aha moments through informal interactions, I'm constantly challenged and enriched by those times when we sit down and purposefully ask questions of one another, from the deceptively simple to the complex. So we're thrilled to be able to add the evening's questions to the conversation. And key among those questions is an utterly Franklinian one. I had to get Franklin in there. That of praxis, of linking our high-minded ideals to action. How do we move these conversations to the broader campus and world, and how do those conversations translate to change in which we can be involved as individuals, as a campus, as a city, as a society? In terms of tonight's event, so many have helped us to make this evening possible, but it's important to recognize a few groups and people in particular. My colleagues at Civic House, full-time and student staff who every day help us live up to our ideals, have been tremendously helpful in getting us to this point. And I want to single out in particular Ellie Porter-Webb, whose energy and commitment have fueled this project from day one. So thank you, Ellie. And importantly, very importantly, this lecture is named in memory and in honor of a man whose devotion to building a better world through service, philanthropy, and family knew no bounds. We are honored to host this lecture in Alvin Gutman's name and thank his family, particularly those who could join us tonight, his wife Mary Burt, his daughter Jane and grandson Peter, and their friends, for having the faith in Civic House and our work that made this lecture possible. Please join me in thanking them. I should note that tomorrow would have been Mr. Gutman's 97th birthday, so we're gathered at a particularly suitable time today. And now it's my privilege to introduce our speaker this evening, John L. Jackson, Jr., Dean of our School of Social Policy and Practice. Dean Jackson has been at Penn since 2006, when he was appointed as the first Penn Integrates Knowledge professor. Just as our human existence and our joys and challenges could be said to be interdisciplinary, so is Dean Jackson's work. And his demonstrated desire to have his scholarly work apply to our lives is evident in all that he does. Personally, I was inspired by his pioneering work in video and scholarship to involve multimedia projects in at least one of my classes, and I know there are legion other stories of students and colleagues who have seen their teaching, research, and the world in new ways as a result of his work. On his appointment as the new dean, which, speaking of anniversaries, was also announced on March 19th of last year, I did a little homework, Penn President Amy Gutman stated, "John is a distinguished teacher, a renowned scholar, and a visionary leader whose work crosses traditional academic boundaries and involves community partners in understanding and confronting societal challenges around the nation and world. He is the best person to advance the School of Social Policy and Practice toward its goal of becoming the leading center for interdisciplinary teaching and research on social innovation, impact, and justice." President Gutman's characterization of his accomplishments and commitment to building a better world help in part explain why we invited him to be our inaugural speaker for this lectureship. And the enthusiasm with which he has embraced the invitation and discussed possible approaches to today's themes only solidified our faith that we found in Dean Jackson the ideal person for today's talk. Please join me in welcoming John Jackson.
I want to say good evening. And, before I do anything else, David just wanted me to let you know that you have a sheet of paper on your chairs. and that sheet of paper is for something we're going to do later on. So you don't have to feel like it's a mandate to write notes. It's going to be part of what we do in a kind of more dialogical way later on today. So just know there's a purpose for it. I want to thank you all for coming out. I always tell people I've been at Penn now for 9 years, just about. And I've been in rooms invited by wonderful people of me and the people inviting me and no one else. So one of the perks of being dean is other people come out now to hear me talk, for better or worse. I do want to start off just by thanking the Gutman family, thanking David Grossman and Civic House for the work they've been doing, Ellie Porter-Webb, who evidently has pulled this all together almost single-handedly. So I appreciate that. I will say I'm very anxious. I sometimes do get anxious when I give talks, but it's hard to talk at home for a whole bunch of reasons. One is I don't want to let you all down. And I feel like the stakes are really high. Talking about critical citizenship in the wake of what's been going on since I began as Dean of the School of Social Policy and Practice. I tell people one of the things I couldn't have anticipated was just how inspiring it's been to be Dean of Penn's Social Justice School with everything that went on in the second half of last year. And the inspiration started with the students. Students who pushed their faculty, pushed their administrators, including their dean, and pushed one another to both do things, right, to be active, to matter in the world, but to put those actions in the context of real, serious, and systematic thought. Allow them to be informed by evidence, by reasoning, by analysis. And so part of what I want to do is kind of talk about why I feel like it's so important for us to have a very good understanding of what we mean by citizenship and of the kinds of citizens we imagine, I think, we're trying to help build and train at a place like Penn. And I want to begin, maybe in a relatively unorthodox way. I'm taking water. Because I want to begin by invoking Ralph Ellison. The Ralph Ellison of Invisible Man. And I haven't done this for a long time. I'm not even sure I totally remember it. But it feels relevant. It feels relevant in a discussion about why it is we have to declare that certain lives even matter. And it's about this relationship, I would argue, between visibility, invisibility, and hypervisibility. And I feel like Ellison does this wonderful job of trying to explain what that feels like and why it's important. When he says, I am an invisible man. I'm invisible, he says, simply because people refuse to see me. Oh, they approach me. Yeah, sure they do. But they only see themselves or their surroundings or figments of their own imagination. Indeed, they see everything, anything, except me. Now, I'm not complaining, nor am I protesting. You see, sometimes it's actually advantageous to be obscene. But other times it can get quite taxing on the nerves. Because you go around getting bumped against by people with poor vision, and you start to doubt whether you do exist in the real world, whether you're a part of all the sound and the anguish, and you lash out with your fist, and you curse, and you swear to make people recognize you. But alas, you're seldom successful. And that, my friends, is the real soul sickness. It's the spear in the side. It's the drag by the neck through the mob-angry crowd. It's the grand inquisition, the embrace of the maiden, the rip in your belly with your guts just spilling out. It's the trip to the chamber that ends with a death so hygienically clean, but it's worse for me. Because I can't even die. I have to go on living. Stupidly. But live you must, I guess. And one could either decide to make passive love with that sickness, or you can burn it out and move on to the next conflicting phase. But what is that next conflicting phase? How often I've tried to find it. For over and over again, I've gone above to search it out. I started out with my own share of optimism. I believed in progress, and I believed in action. But ultimately, I decided my world instead is going to be one of infinite possibilities. Wonderful phrase, infinite possibilities. Good phrase. And a good view of life. And a good man shouldn't have any other. You step outside the narrow confines of what men call reality, and you can step into chaos or imagination. And that too I've learned down here in my cellar. But I haven't learned that by deadening my own sense of perception. No, because I'm invisible. I'm invisible. But I'm not blind. Part of, I think, the point of trying to relay in some, and believe me, I butchered that, right? I mean, I completely butchered that. But part of the point, I think, of trying to articulate some of what I think is the angst and the anguish in some of what the invisible man represents is to make a case about how and why I think we need to think differently about what citizenship is. So when I think about citizenship, one of the people that comes to mind, it's someone who folks here probably have heard a lot about, a guy named Habermas, who talked about the ways in which we can imagine a different notion of publics and public spheres in these 18th century coffee houses in Europe. And the idea that Habermas tried to offer up is, I think, a very compelling one. It feels really good. But ultimately, I think it's one of the traps we fall into when we think about what it means to be a citizen in a place like the US in the 21st century. And basically, in a nutshell, and I'm going to be butchering this because I'm not a political scientist, but I'm going to get my point across. His argument is we should be understanding ourselves as rational, reasonable beings. And there's all this stuff that we are, that we believe, that we're committed to, that cloud our rational faculties. So the goal, and what he imagines was possible, someone of those 18th century coffee houses, is to produce a political subject who can be a fully reasoning subject. All the stuff that makes us biased, self-interested, partial, some ways an anthropologist would say all the stuff that makes us human, we leave at the door of that coffee house. And we come in almost like this metaphor of us being minds melding together to try to build a public sphere, build a community that's as reasonable, rational, organized as it can be. And all that other stuff gets in the way of it. What's the stuff I'm talking about? I'm talking about things like race and racial identity. I'm talking about religion. Oh, religion's terrible, right? If you're going to have a conversation across a divide. I'm talking about ethnicity, sexuality, gender. All of that stuff gets in the way of rational debate, the argument is. So we have to find a way to bracket it out. Right? What that is a holdover from a different era that doesn't allow us to be as pristine political subjects as we would want to be, as the ideal, a certain kind of version of a rational ideal would be. I often liken it to the understanding we have coming out of someone like Descartes that tries to make the case, and I think it's a powerful one and we all know it. I think, therefore I am, right? Cogito ergo sum or something like that. Is that what it is? Right. And part of the argument there is we understand ourselves to exist. We understand ourselves as human as a function of our ability to even doubt that fact. Right? There's something about our reasoning capacities that defines our species being. And my claim is that's actually not the way an anthropologist would think about it. And for better or worse, that's how I'm trained. And what we recognize is that part of what defines us as a species are all those very things we imagine get in the way of our idealized version of what it means to be a political subject. The stuff we imagine we want to bracket out or leave at the front door of that 18th century coffee house. That's who and what we are. It constitutes our identity. One of the things I was trained to think about and to teach other people as a graduate student was this idea that race isn't biologically real. Folks have heard this idea before, right? That race is actually just culture masquerading as biology. And that our job as anthropologists who knew exactly how that particular magic trick of turning what was culture into nature, how that worked, was to disabuse people of that false understanding. What was the point? The point was somehow if we kind of decoupled investments in race from assumptions about genetic, biological, inherent, and natural organizing principles for its existence, we can get people to divest from some of the most pernicious ways in which we deploy the category in our everyday lives. If it's not natural, if it's merely cultural, well, we must be able to change it. Right? We used to always have these nature-nurture debates. We never talk in those terms anymore, nature versus nurture. But the argument was really about trying to make a case for things being in the nature category. Because if they were in the nature category, it meant they were hard and fast. They meant really, honestly, to try to change them would be to try to produce something that was, by definition, unnatural. Hard to make that case, right? And so one of the ways in which we imagine we can do our work was to just get people to understand all the reasons why race might feel natural. It might do real work for us as a social category. It clearly has political implications, but it isn't actually biologically real. That was it. Now, at the same time, we were learning something else that I think actually operates at cross purposes with that particular perspective. We were also being told that there's something sui generis, there's something independently powerful about culture. That culture actually can do its work, can be quite potent, even without the moorings of biology to prop it up. That's what we were being taught. That's why we were studying it. Which is part of the reason why it was misguided, I think, to imagine you can just get people to recognize race isn't biological in the way you thought it might have been, and then they'll let go of it. Because one of the things we realize about any kind of cultural investment is it doesn't need biology to do its work. I remember we used to often have these debates when I was in graduate school about the extent to which, ultimately, if you were thinking about deconstructing race, after you were done deconstructing it, there was anything left of the subject at all. And we can do this with any category, right? Most of the stuff we imagine to be natural, the reason why culture works at all, of course, the anthropologists would say, is because it passes itself off all the time as nature. Our job is actually to prove to people that most of what they think is natural is just a naturalization of the cultural, just like race. So race isn't exceptional in that sense, right? It's representative of how most of culture works. If you're not thinking about a cultural practice or process as somehow feeling, as natural as the air you breathe, it's almost a version of weak culture. Culture at its strongest is silent, right? It is who and what you are. So that if you tell someone, for instance, race isn't real, or the way you think about sort of gender or sexuality isn't real, or even just that your God isn't real, part of what you're trying to tell them isn't the same thing as saying, well, take off this cultural garb and put on a different one, which is often how we think about it, right? Right? If it's culture, we can just change it, exchange it, do something. No, what you're telling them actually is that something about who and what constitutes your being, your existence, is wrong. That's a radical claim, even an offensive claim to make to people. It's not like you can tell someone race isn't real, or your approach, your understanding of your sexual identity is somehow warped or bizarre or inaccurate, and they can and should just be able to change to something else. If culture is all we ultimately have, I always tell students the anthropological definition of culture carries a lot of weight and captures a lot of things. All the stuff that people fight over, that they kill and die for, this is the stuff of culture. So even though we spend a lot of time, and historically have, trying to think about how to place things into the nature box, really what we're battling over is always already just in the culture box. Even if we think the rhetorical muscle of nature allows us to do different kinds of work in our arguments with folks who believe different things. And so one of the ways in which I think we can think differently about this notion of culture and how it affects the discussions we need to have in the 21st century about why we can even have to have a dialogue about whether or not certain races, cultures, groups matter or not, is a function of what Glenn Loury, an economist, who I find incredibly powerful, though people don't read him anymore for a whole bunch of different reasons, talked about when he tried to get us to understand the circles we draw between us's and them's. And part of his point is simply to say, if you interrogate yourself, one of the things you begin to recognize pretty quickly is, although we're all social animals, right? No, not I think, therefore I am, we are. Right? We've created a cultural scaffolding and canopy, therefore I am. Right? Without that cultural stuff, all the things that make us human vanish. There's no humanity without it. We used to do all these studies, folks still must do it somewhere, on feral children. You remember those studies? Folks raised in the wild. Part of the point of those studies is to try to do the quintessentially anthropological thing of defining what makes us different from other species. And really the thing is one another. And the way we interact with one another, the way we use our sociality to build cultural bridges between one another. But we build those bridges quite specifically. We build them towards certain areas, and we block them off when they're going in directions we don't want to go. And so Glenn Loury's point is, if you think about how we understand the contemporary political and social world, the first question we have to ask is, when you say us, who do you mean? And who's not a part of that us? And that the sort of politics of us versus them is really key. It means you can think about something that happens, say, in South Philadelphia to be our problem or their problem. You can imagine your relationship to the state apparatus as being one that's a relationship between us's and them's, or we. And a we that really is all-encompassing and inclusive. But think first and foremost about how you configure your us becomes a version of the answer. How do you do it and why? Where do you draw your boundaries and how are you taught to do that? One of the things you realize is it's very easy to reproduce exclusions. We often talk about how universities like University of Pennsylvania they definitely give lip service to the idea of inclusion, but it's often hard to institutionalize in ways that really work. It's really difficult to do that. And so even when you're trying to do it, you can reproduce the opposite of what you're trying for. Exclusions you're not even anticipating. So the first thing Loury wants us to think about is when we're invested in an us that we imagine to be linked to a particular notion of a body politic, what is the us and why? And why do you draw the line where you do? And just think about that. Because the answer you give for that question explains a lot about what you prioritize, how you build your investment in particular kinds of political endgames and finish lines, and the ways you think and articulate solutions to quote-unquote social problems. The reason why I started with Ralph Ellison is because I want to imagine that one of our biggest mistakes is to imagine we can simply intellectualize ourselves out of our problems. Right? That really, again, like Habermasian's mind floating around in a coffee house somewhere, thinking itself into political existence, that if we can just short circuit our connection to our guts, our emotion, our feelings, then that give us a better chance of getting to this sort of finish line of political inclusion and equality. And I want to argue that's actually a wrong-headed place to begin. Because we aren't human because we can be rational. That's part of what defines our species being. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And our job is to figure out what's the relationship between our intellectual capacity and all the other stuff that fills out our being. When we talk about race, one of the first things I tell people is, you can have a very good argument that should actually, in all the ways we might imagine, a clear sort of rhetorician to be able to justify and stamp with their approval stamp, you might be able to make a very good case for how and why your understanding of the relationship you forge with other folks in your community should be something other people agree with. Right? You can make a really rational case for how you understand the world, how you understand yourself, the way you draw your us in the world. But ultimately, often the reasons why we're invested in things aren't simply because we think intellectually they make sense. Our investments aren't just, we often say irrational, like somehow it means they're wrong, bad, can't be justified. They're affect-laden. They're cathected. They're in our gut. They're in our soul. We feel them. W.E.B. Du Bois once asked, and people always bring it up, what does it feel like to be a problem? Right? And we often focus on the problem side of things. But a colleague of mine, David Kim, up in Connecticut, always emphasizes the feeling side of things. That is to say, what does it feel like to be considered a problem? To be understood as a threat, as dysfunctional, as pathological? To be trained to either internalize and inculcate that idea or to organize your very existence around trying to beat it back. What does that feel like? Part of what I like about the Ellison is it's all about what it feels like to be invisible. What does it feel like? And his point is to say, you can try to capture that feeling, but there's no way to imagine it's reducible to an intellectual argument about why that's wrong. That's a different project. They're both valid projects, and they both have a part to play in the conversation, but their roles, their functions are very different. And our job is to figure out how to, I would argue, figure out how to combine them. What does it mean to be rational, to be thinking seriously about these questions, about our place in the world, but doing it in a way that leaves some space for our passion, right? For our emotion, for our investments that are about things that are in our soul, right? Not just in our synapses in our head. And I think if we can at least begin to have the conversation about what kind of citizen that would be, then I think we get out of escape some other problematic things we tend to do probably more often than we should. So the one thing we tend to imagine, of course, is there's something sacred, so sacred, about the nation state and our commitment to it, that of course we can't be critical. Right? We often hear it talked about as being un-American to be critical. Right? It's actually probably nothing more American than criticizing what we imagine to be the distance between our ideals and our practice. Folks who've been calling themselves Americans have been doing that for a very long time, a really long time. And what I always tell people is, honestly, the ideals were a setup to begin with. Because there's no way we could have ever lived up to them. Now, clearly, you can get closer than we have. But the ideals are up here. There's no civilization that's lived up to those ideals. That's why we laud them so much. Because they are so incredible, theoretically. Now, our goal is to figure out what does it mean to recognize we're fallible, to know we're not perfect, to realize we haven't gotten anywhere near where we purport ourselves to be, right? So there's a whole discussion about hypocrisy we could have, right? Because it's one thing to say, well, these are ideals and we're not there yet. It's nothing to pretend we are, right? To pretend actually we've solved it. And that's, I think, part of the discussion we're having is a discussion about whether or not we can be honest about the fact that ideals are ideals because they're not real, by definition, or masquerading around this sort of pretend argument about us already reaching the pinnacles of what we imagine ourselves to potentially one day be. And I think it's that tension we see often played out on the streets of America and in the most powerful halls in Washington. I would argue it's a version of, are we going to be real about our ideals and what they mean, or are we going to be, in some ways, much more both disingenuous and or maybe self-deluded about those very same ideals in their relationship to what we do every day. And it's that kind of dynamic, I think, that also informs what I think is really critical for us if we're going to make sense of what was happening last year. So I'm going to often say things maybe in overly provocative ways just because I don't want people to fall asleep or something. You know? And sometimes I say it because I also feel like, well, maybe I believe it in that second. Maybe I won't believe it 2 seconds later, but I believed it when I said it. But I want to talk about one version of what I think is really important about the argument around structural racism And I haven't formulated it. I've never even sort of said it in public, but I'm trying to think it through. So maybe we can talk about it a little bit later as well. But so we all, I think most of us, hopefully, have a sense of what people might purport to mean when they say structural racism, say. Maybe even institutional racism. You know, I've written in the past about all the ways in which we've tried to dissect and unpack and parse out versions of what we imagine to be different dynamics of racialism. Right? Different ways in which we operationalize a kind of racial animus in ways that affect other people around us. And so one of the ways I talk about that is, of course, as this move, and anyone who's read my work will see some of this in the Racial Paranoia book, between racism we codified in law, right? So the de jure race. This was racism that was on the books, right? Racism that was actually legal, right? It was the law of the land. It was unabashedly racist, right? To a racism that in some ways got pulled out of the legal code, but still carried the day in terms of everyday norms and conventions, what you call de facto racism, right? And that move, and I think it's an incredibly important move, both comes as an advance, but also makes things much more difficult to make sense of and understand. And one of the arguments I make is that that's probably not even the only way to think about it. I think we moved into actually a different domain. We've even done a pretty good job at making some of the erstwhile versions of de facto racism, right, some of those versions, not necessarily acceptable in that public sphere. And so I talk about how that actually creates this different kind of dynamic and problematic. I used to see it a lot when I worked up in Harlem and did research. My dissertation was up in Harlem, New York, looking at race and class up there. And there were a lot of Harlem residents who, you know, have their family histories traced back to the South, and they would often, sometimes jokingly, sometimes not so much, would often invoke the Deep South and say, well, you know, they wished in some ways they were back in the Deep South because at least back there, what? You knew where you stood, right? There's something actually sort of existentially comforting about knowing who the good guys are to you and who the bad guys are, right? One group wears white hats, other group wears black hats, right? You can see each other, right? And that part of what they were lamenting was this idea that actually they'd moved into the realm where they couldn't even trust that when folks were performing good guy things, that they really were good guys. Because we've done such a fantastic job making it not a good thing to be overtly racist. Right? So, and I tell people, remember, for the vast history of the Republic, it's been not just, you know, okay to be racist. You won the political campaigns on the back of racial discrimination. Right? That was the organizing principle and logic for the political order, period. Right? That's for the majority of the history of this country. It's only been since the 1960s, and this is an incredible feat. I don't even think we recognize how profound a change this is. It's significant, right? But for a relatively short period of time, I always tell people, I feel like I'm relatively young, so not much longer than before I was born, that began to sharply change. And so instead, it becomes much more difficult to imagine that you can be in the public sphere, be a political figure, and not get drummed out of office as a function of one of these moments when you're showing this kind of historical version of racism. Now, what I always try to, as sort of an aside or a disclaimer, is to realize it's not like overt forms of racism have also just gone away completely. So there's still overt racism in the world. But the idea is the balance between imagining a public sphere that's organized around the proper expression of racial disdain to one that says, well, you have to be very careful if you're going to invoke race at all, because we've agreed, right? An anthropologist, a guy named Taos would call it public secret. The public secret is you're not supposed to say it even if you feel it. And so what I talk about in the Racial Paranoia book is this move not just from sort of race in the legal code to race kind of as hegemonic and explicit in the social order, this moment when even in the social order it doesn't quite carry the sort of public value it once did. And so now where has it gone? And my argument is one of the things that contaminates the kind of conversations we have about race is we no longer trust our interlocutors. So the folks in Harlem, right, when I was there in the early 1990s, were saying at least they could trust the folks in the South who, if they didn't like it, they'd tell you. They'd call you the N-word and tell you going about your business. But you knew what they were telling you was what they felt, and that there's some ways in which one of the byproducts of the success we've had in terms of demonizing explicit forms of racial animus is we recognize that the chasm between the kind of public proliferation of racist investment that we had even as late as the 1950s and 60s, and the relative silence we have in the public and political order around racism in 2015 doesn't seem to just mean all the racists have gone away. Maybe that's not it, becomes a version of the question. Now, there are colleagues who invoke questions of structural racism and say, well, one of the ways this operates is you can have racism without racists, people like Edward Bonilla Silva and others. I think the other way I want to think about, and I think that's exactly what we need to be understanding, we're going to try to figure out how to make sense of what I call this kind of peekaboo notion of racism, or this gotcha notion of racism. We're imagining we're probably not going to see it most of the time, but we'll see it in these sort of microaggressive ways, maybe. We'll see it in these ways that still allow moments of plausible deniability, right? That maybe it is, maybe it's not. But the other thing I want to think about is the extent to which a discussion about structural racism also explains how and why we can and cannot take racism personally. And what do I mean by take racism personally? I always tell people, I like this sort of feminist adage about the personal is political. And we talk a lot about all the ways in which we want to connect institutional investments to the most intimate crevices of our everyday interactions. Those things are linked. We have to find the links. We have to find the connective tissue. But what I think is really interesting, and people always ask me sort of, how do you understand your relationship to the academy, the difficulties we're having around thinking about equality both within and outside of academia, and all the work going on around this discussion of racism that either you're not supposed to talk about anymore, because now the only racists left, ostensibly, are the folks who invoke race to begin with. Right? So there's that logic, right? This kind of, topsy-turvy order that says to bring up race is to be the only person in the room that's even thinking about it. If you would stop thinking about it, it would go away. So you're the problem. Right? I mean, and again, and in some ways, there's something about that logic you understand. It says no one's saying it. You're the one bringing it up, right? No one's calling you the N-word and telling you, right? So why are you seeing it and feeling it? And so part of what I think becomes really interesting in this moment is then we begin to operate in this other domain in terms of trying to make sense of exactly how and why it is there's still something about the dynamics we reproduce that don't feel as egalitarian and as inclusive as they should. I try to tell people, if you want to look in a mirror, the first thing you should do is look at your most intimate social networks. How diverse are they? And define diversity any way you want. How diverse, when you sit down at your dinner tables, right? When you plan your weddings, when you think about the most important ritualistic ceremonial moments every year, who's with you? And how diverse is that network? Now, when I bring it up, it's not meant to say, well, we don't have to deal with structural institutional racism, right? It's all about sort of us and the people we like or don't like, which is how people, I think, sometimes misinterpret that move. It says the institutional issues are linked to and built on the back of our interpersonal relationships as well. So they're also on the table and have to be thematized. So just think about it. What are your social networks like? Now, whether or not you're trying to be exclusionary, one thing you can do just as a sheer function of doing what you've done all day, every day since you were born, is reproduce exclusion without trying to do so. That's why a place like Penn, that's why the Academy does all of this work to try to make sure they can see the forms of exclusion that don't seem obvious, because they've always been so easily institutionalized. But part of what I think that allows me to also realize is whenever I see what I imagine to be the most explicit instantiations of racial investment, either institutional or interpersonal, I realize that part of what racism means, and this I think links back to this question of how and if at all Black Lives Matter, but part of what it means, in a sense, is that I, as an individual, ostensibly don't exist. And what do I mean by that? I mean, part of what is happening in that moment is a discussion about who and what I am, who and what we are, that says there are certain individuals, quote unquote, that aren't a part of the body politic, aren't a part of our political community in the ways that the us I draw completely and wholly are. Again, it doesn't have to be 3/5 compromise. It can be just a notion of us that says, well, I just don't know who they are and I don't care because they're not like me. I recently wrote a piece, and I think it came off unanticipatedly depressing to people in the Chronicle of Higher Education about, there was their title. They called it What It Feels Like to Be a Black Professor. That wasn't my title. But part of what I wanted the piece to do was to try to understand to people how shocking it was for me to sit down with a whole bunch of really important, probably the most well-cited Black academics in multiple fields all around the country, and to hear almost the exact same thing from every one of them. And it was some version of, my colleagues don't respect me, my colleagues don't care about me, my colleagues don't think I'm valuable. And these are folks who, when you look at them on paper, not only should they be considered central to their fields, in some ways they are the center of their fields. And so part of my point was, what is it that produces, again, this sense that isn't about people calling them out of their name, telling them that they're not allowed in the building, right? But that still gives a sense of what it feels like to be considered here, part of this community, but maybe not quite completely part of it. A legal studies scholar, this guy named Devin Carbato, makes this distinction between what he calls American citizenship and American identity. And he says American citizenship, in some ways, at least for some folks, and in some contexts, not all of them, it's almost relatively easy, what it means to be a citizen. But that part of what you realize about American identity is that American identity pivots on the idea that not all citizens are created equal. That to be an American, to really embrace what America stands for, is to recognize America's differential investment. And don't worry, they're not protesting. These are folks going out of class. They told me they had to leave early. I don't think they're protesting. See you later, thanks. Is that part of what that means is that investment we have in Americanness is one that separates itself from simply a discussion about the formalities of citizenship and belonging vis-a-vis the state. It's about what it feels like to be American and who feels you to be a part of that us that is the national community and collectivity. And so part of what I think becomes key for us then, part of what I'll do is try to maybe begin to give you a sense of what I think are the maybe 3 or 4 key points that I wanted some of these conversations to help you think about. The first one really is, what is the place of affect, of emotion, of feeling in our discussion in the citizen? I think if we're going to be serious about really understanding in the 21st century our political investments, we can't be afraid of gnashing of teeth. We can't be afraid of emotionality. Again, not at the expense of intellectuality, but as something that works in this really complicated, wonderful way in tandem with it. And that actually a robust intellectual project is one that doesn't shy away from its sort of really important affect-laden sort of responses and implications, but that tries to understand this wonderful balance we do as a species between the stuff we feel and that we know we're invested in because it's here, and the stuff we can think about and intellectually justify. Knowing, of course, half the time we use this to try to rationalize this anyway. That's part of what our project's always been. So that's one thing. I think the second thing I want us to really try to think about is, what's the us, and maybe it seems too self-evident, but maybe what's the us-them question in the discussions that we've been having, the marching, the protests, in the wake of Ferguson and Garner and everyone else? What's the us-them dynamic there? And how hard and fast do we draw that line? I remember I wrote a piece to just our SP2 community at the end of last semester, telling them, I feel like there's no way we can imagine our position is to simply tell students they can't protest what they imagine to be the incredible injustice that happened as a function of the police officers not even being considered by the legal system in any substantive way for reprimand, right, in any formal way. Or I guess they're considered, but not to the extent they should have been, is what the students are arguing. And part of what I think we've been able to do is set up this dichotomy that says either you're with the folks who are protesting or you're the us of the protesters, or you're with the us of the police force. That is either or. Like, that's it. And so anything you do that seems to imply that the police aren't this idealized version of a protective force for us, right, this idealized version, is clearly because you're, quote unquote, anti-police. Another same version of this sort of anti-American discourse. And I want to figure out exactly how much of that rhetoric is either disingenuous, and I think some of it might be, right, cynical and political in that kind of way, and how much of it is us really misunderstanding the kinds of fuzzy and nuanced edges to all of the social communities and collectivities we invest ourselves in. Ultimately, if I want us to really understand anything, I want us to imagine that if we're going to make sense of what happened, it's always too simple to imagine the answer is one single solitary line. I mean, if you ever hear someone telling you that a solution to one of these big intractable problems is this simple, turn around and run the other way. Because they're probably going to say it with this sort of air of self-evidentiality, right? They've already probably convinced themselves that it's true. And trust me, if it were, we would have solved this a long time ago. So the key is to recognize that there's something too simplistic about that either-or dynamic that I think then reinforces a whole bunch of other sort of subsequent moves we make as analysts, as political agents, that want to make all of these questions simple if we just did one or two simple things. And I think they're much more complicated than it. Even the question about the relationship between structure and agency. Right? Often we want to imagine that really either you're blaming the victim, right, by saying folks have any culpability, or you're saying people have no responsibility for anything, it's always just this demonic state. And actually, part of what we're trying to figure out is how much of this to lay at the foot of the institutional apparatus that reproduces this, and some of it has to be there. And how much of this is about us, even despite that fact, trying to figure out a response that owns and accepts our own agentive possibility in the world. Agency never means you can do anything whenever you want for all time. Like, I think what we want to imagine agency to be, now I think it's an old reference, but I always feel like it's the best example of some of what I think we get wrong about what agents are. We want an agent to be, you remember the movie The Matrix? We want agents to be Neo from The Matrix, right? You remember Neo? So Neo in The Matrix is like the god of The Matrix. There are no rules for Neo, right? Or if there are rules, they're rules he can bend any way he wants. And we want to imagine our notion of agency to always be a Neo notion of agency, right? It's almost like we can do whatever we want. If we can't, then we're not agents. But I want to argue it's actually never going to be a Neo version of agency, even if that's what we might imagine and pretend is possible. Our version of agency is like all the folks working around Neo, right, including Morpheus, right, and all the other characters, who actually have to abide by all the rules of the Matrix, right? They have strategies and tools to protect themselves in certain moments, but they can't do whatever they want, whenever they want, however they want. That's never an agent. I don't know what that is. That's not even a human being, right? That's some other kind of figure. In that film, it's this salvific sort of, Jesus figure. But it's not us. So owning a version of citizenship, point two, that is quintessentially and inescapably human. It means it's not perfect. It hasn't reached the ideals. The finish line isn't there. And all the stuff that some of us, either imagine are only working at cross purposes with the democratic ethos, right? The stuff we imagine we want to put to the side because if we did, our democracy would be so much stronger. That's all we have. That is us. That constitutes us. And so how do we get closer to that line going through the cultural material that constitutes us, right? Not pretending it away, like Habermas does, pretending we can just be a mind, say. And with that brain, think ourselves through that. So that's the second thing. What kind of human agents are these citizens to be? The third point, I think, that becomes key for us to think about is exactly what kind of, sort of post-racialism we want. Now, I would imagine any investment in post-racialism, I would argue, is probably a misplaced goal. And usually what people mean by post-racialism is really repressing discussions about race, not truly transcending them. We want to transcend them. We want to think we've gotten behind them, beyond them. We want to imagine somehow that history won't continue to plague and torment us. But part of what I want us to think about is, how do we understand this version of race that, even if it's not biological, still is an investment that's cultural in the ways everything else is cultural, and that we have to deal with? And how do we do it? The reason why I think it's so important to think about race and paranoia, which is what I've been trying to talk about in some of my work for a while now, is because I think the very concept of race, the idea of race, is already built into it, embedded in it, this paranoia. Race is, by definition, fear of another. It's fear of another then crystallized into this monstrosity we imagine to be abject, absolute difference. And race, again, we use nature to do that. We don't need to use nature. Race becomes just one version of how to take this idea, this fearful idea, and operationalize it into a project that says the us I'm drawing is linked to a certain understanding of what I look like, of where I come from, and of how different that is from the folks who look different from me and come from a different part of the planet than I do. And so understanding how and why, we actually need to think seriously about how all the stuff we've been trained to understand about race actually are things we have a responsibility to either accept or reject, to rewind and remix, to reimagine. That's our goal, that's our job. And it becomes that much more difficult, I would argue, once we've already done our due diligence at trying to deconstruct race to death, right? To say it's not biologically real. It can still do the work it's always done, sometimes very pernicious work, without those biological bulwarks to prop it up. So that's the thing. And the fourth and final thing I'll say that I think the sort of critical citizen subject, trying to be an agent, trying to think about how to change a world where Black Lives Matter can become this galvanizing prompt that separates us from thems and that mobilizes what I think is this really unexpected but potentially really promising form of political activity in the late 2014. And what we have to recognize is, as much as history is inescapable, as much as we need to make sure we know it, all the answers to this relatively emergent and newfangled version of what this racial polity is, all of the stuff we've never had before that I talked about earlier, means we can't simply take the conceptual toolkits from the 1950s or 60s and apply them lock, stock, and barrel to 2015. Sometimes we want to imagine that's possible. Even when the things look exactly the same, even when we're dealing with tropes, we're dealing with sort of performances that harken back explicitly to that time. All right, so think about that sort of, was it Oklahoma, where the fraternity got reprimanded and then got disbanded for chanting that sort of, really violent racist chant. Part of what I want people to recognize is that is and is not like the racisms of old. It is and is not. So part of what we have to do is kind of this two-step. We have to put it in the context of American history that makes that moment possible and legible to us. We've heard it before. We've seen it before. It's actually terrifying, and justifiably so. At the very same time, I think we can, and I would argue, when I hear it, I recognize the group of folks that don't even necessarily fully comprehend and understand the kind of rhetoric they're deploying, and definitely aren't invested in it exactly the same way as the Bull Connors of old. Again, not to say that the difference is so absolute, right, so complete that there's not a lineage there. But we have to be nuanced enough, at least we have the luxury, I think, in a place like the Academy, to figure out exactly what parts of history does this reproduce and what version of the same old tropes does it completely reconceptualize. And so that's our job, is to say it's both part of this historical trajectory and something we've never seen before. Part of why I think Obama is so important is because he really does allow us to recognize that we can both advance and retreat on these fronts at the exact same time. We can do it at the exact same time. We can both be incredibly impressive in our ability to bring things into being we would have imagined impossible even 15, 20 years ago. And in that context, under that very umbrella, reproduce what we imagined to have been the things we had transcended and left alone decades earlier. And so how do we hold those contradictions together, in tension, productively at the same time. I would argue the other position I would take as an anthropologist is that's exactly what defines our species being as well, that we can do that. We can be, by definition, inconsistent, contradictory. But what I'm hoping is we don't imagine that just because things have seemed to calm down a little bit in 2015, at least for a second, in terms of sort of the political agitation, which we hadn't seen people were talking about since the 1960s, right? At least in that configuration. But again, it's part of a longer trajectory, a trajectory that included Occupy, which we hadn't seen before, right? That included all these attempts to take ideas and commitments to social justice, commitments to equality, and to translate those into modes of sociality that felt like those ideas we had in our thought bubbles when we said the word. And that's, for me, that's a very inspiring project even to undertake. But we also have to recognize that our job is to know that we're going to be thwarted, we're going to be frustrated, we're actually going to get it wrong some of the time. We're maybe even going to be our own worst enemies in some of these instances. But if we're lucky, we're not going to give up the fight of trying to find a way to get to where it is we said we wanted to be all along. And if nothing else, and I'll close on this, if nothing else, I think part of what becomes for me so incredibly valuable about any discussion coming out of Civic House around what social justice should be, how we teach it to our students, what counts, even the idea of what counts as social justice, isn't a given. We battle over this in SP2 all the time. Sometimes it's framed, I was telling David earlier, as this debate between whether or not you're going to sort of go into the system, right? And maybe even ostensibly, if you're lucky, fix it from within. Or if your project is exclusively to stand outside of it, to rail and to dismantle it, brick by brick, piece by piece. You will accept nothing else. And I want to argue that it's okay to have this sort of ideological, hardline perspective. But part of our job is to recognize that if we're going to make this work, the only way we do it, I would say, is to understand fundamentally that our species being, what defines us, our difference from every other species on this planet, ironically enough, that those very things, I could delineate them, but you probably know them, are the same things we use to separate us one from another. And we do that because we choose to do that. Not because it's manna from on high, not because Mother Nature made us do it, right? Not simply because it was preordained by some God. We do it because we choose to do it. And our job is to figure out, I would argue, what choices do we make that we stand behind, that we justify, that we feel and think work for us and for those around us. And the answer is usually a function of how generous you want to be. I think it's usually a function of how wide a circle of us's you want to include. And it's also, I think, a function of the kinds of things you learn to think about, to privilege, to fight over, to discuss, and to really, really scrutinize at a place like the University of Pennsylvania. And to do all of that stuff, doesn't mean when it's all said and done, you're going to have some sort of magic equation that gets you to a political finish line. But I think at the very least, it means you have a fighting chance to be a citizen that's worthy of the kinds of things we imagine we want for the folks that come behind us. Because we're responsible. And if we don't, I would argue this, and I will end here, if we don't find a way to both be committed to this project, to think about how history continues to haunt us in the present, and to understand a way of working that anticipates folks who are going to be fighting sometimes against the stuff we imagine to be self-evidently fair now that we don't even realize, right? Again, there's so many things we have already explicitly thematized for ourselves as being open to, ready for debate and deconstruction. There's so many more we haven't even begun to thematize. And so our project is to just continue, I think, to do the kind of work we need to do to build a notion of public that's as inclusive as it can be and that's as self-conscious as it can be. Taking nothing for granted, knowing, I think, the finish line isn't preordained, but recognizing that the process of working through this stuff, talking with people seriously about this stuff is what's key. And it really won't work if the only people doing the talking, doing the debating, doing the working are people who really, as much as they might share a kind of political canopy that connects them, as much as they might all be deemed officially, technically citizens, are folks talking as strangers who don't know one another, not deeply, not intimately, who really don't care about one another. Again, not seriously. I want to think that part of what we have to do, I went to a school in North Philadelphia last semester. One of the great things about being dean at SP2 is it puts me in the community much more than I'd ever been before, right? So I go up to Harlem, I go to Israel, I go to South Africa, I go to Jamaica. I'm not in Philadelphia. And this is a place that catapults me into parts of Philly I've never been before. And I sat down with a principal in North Philadelphia who convinced me in ways that I found very powerful that his first order of business was to prove to the students in that building, to prove to his charges that they were loved. He said if he didn't do that, he can try to teach them all the math he can put in front of them. He could try to teach them to read about Jane and Spot and everybody else. But nothing would work if they didn't buy fundamentally that they were cared for and loved by him and by all the people he hired. And I'd never really quite heard a principal talk in those terms before, and it was clear he was serious, too. That was the other thing. He meant it. But the rhetoric could just be good and nothing behind it. But what really brought it home and moved me, shook me even, was the fact that when one of his students took me around that building, it was clear to me in 15 seconds, they felt loved. They felt protected. They felt cared for by the staff, by the teachers, by the administrators. And so some of what I also want to say is none of this stuff matters. Criticality, our investments in citizenship, the conversation we want to have, if we don't care about the people we're talking to. And so it seems so flippant and maybe even superficial to invoke terms like love, which we say very easily. But none of this matters if we don't care. Part of the point in Black Lives Matter is it feels, and I think in some ways accurately so, that we don't care about some of our fellow citizens. That's what it feels like. And so our job is to both figure out exactly how we can demonstrate and operationalize a commitment and to actually ask ourselves, if we don't care, why? Why not? Because it's not worth it to have a conversation, to have a rally, to do anything, if at the end of the day, we're not interacting with people we fundamentally really want to succeed and who we really care about. And so I want to think that our project really, in the context of this continuing battle, is to try to figure out how and why it is we've forgotten what it feels like to love, why that's become invisible to us. And I think it's that invisibility that makes it so difficult for us to see people who don't look the way we look, who don't do the things we do, who don't believe what we believe. And for the anthropologists, those are the people we start with. Those are the people we run to. Because ultimately, part of what our job is to find a way to understand how we can all occupy the same space, be in the same buildings, sometimes read the same books, breathe the same air, and think so differently about the world. And if we can start to do that in ways, even in small ways, that don't just get us to change other people's opinions, but get us to think differently about the stuff we take for granted, then I think we have a shot of really building a citizenry in the 21st century of people who can build a better future, a better republic, and get even that much closer to those ideals we've lauded for so very, very long. So I'll stop there. Thanks, you guys.